Hello! Today I'll take you through the process of making a leather jacket from scratch and distressing it. To start off, I bought a big old leather jacket secondhand. I chose this one because of its size and big panels. First I removed the lining, this goes in the washer. Then I open up the jacket and clean the outside of it. While that is drying, I made a mock-up in felt. This is because it had a similar weight and stretch as the leather. I'm trying to copy the jacket that I see on screen, so I'll copy the panels as best as I can. I thought I'd had way more material than I needed, but that was not the case. I barely had enough. I tried to minimize visible piecing and got away with only piecing the sleeve. The inside, however, is a real Franken mess. I start piecing my pieces together. They were stitched by machine. You can't pin leather, so I had to go out and buy those clips all the DIYers are using. They work well for this, but I prefer my pins. I tried using upholstery thread, but switched to jeans thread later. For each stitch you make in leather, it's weakened, so it's better to have a bit of a longer stitch length and a good thread. I hammer the seams flat and use fabric glue to keep it in place. This was done to all the seams done in leather. I started by making the back. On this panel you see that I didn't have enough material and I had to cut it too close to a button. This made this piece a little smaller but didn't alter the look too much. I added iron-on interfacing to all of the pieces that are on the outside. This is necessary to strengthen them. On the back I used woven interfacing, making them less rigid. The rest of the jacket got the cheaper thin one, similar to what was used on the old jacket. Since the back pieces are curved, I marked the middle, pinned half of it and manipulated it into shape while stitching. Sorry. I clipped away the corner and the seams were flattened and glued. I never tried putting this under the machine, but I doubt it would be able to sew this. The jacket in the show looks to be sewn by machine, but this is a big boring panel and out of fear that it would look too modern, I used hand stitching. The front panels were interfaced and I started with the pockets. These are the easiest pass-plated pockets I have and will ever make. I've been one of those purists who don't believe glue should ever be used in sewing, but this was almost fun to sew. Use glue if you need to, I'm not judging. Obviously this method will only work for leather or plasticky fabrics like sky. I reused the old pockets from the jacket, but had to make a new flap for one of the sides since the old one had been stitched to death. The pocket was simply top stitched in, gluing them in place first helped everything lay nicely as I sewed. And when you're stitching leather, you only got one shot, you can't unpick the stitching, so I took it slow. This is a motorcycle jacket and they have arm gussets. This is because movement of the arms happen to be of somewhat importance. My gussets consist of two banana shapes sewn together, then the smaller side is sewn to the back arm side and the other one to the sleeve. I made my own pattern and didn't have a jacket to reference. They function but doesn't look exactly like what they should in the end. This was a big bulky seam and I had to top stitch it to make it lay flat. My machine was having an awful time with it and I had to do it by hand. I did also not have a very good time either. As most of you who know the show already know, Blackbeard's costume is a Mad Max cosplay, which makes it pretty modern, but they've decided to make a costume that could technically be made in the 1700s. As with most of the show, it's more like they've traveled back in time and tried to make a modern show. A biker jacket closes with a zipper, but that's not very 18th century, so instead we have buttons. But they haven't changed the pattern for the biker jacket and we still have this type of closure. I've always referred to these buttons as Paddington buttons, but they probably have a name. Anyway, I could only find them in red and I need 4 of them. I used leather scraps to keep them in place. As is, this isn't very secure and I had to go over them later with thread as well. I did a lot of funny and probably unnecessary stitching here, also that it would look like the one in the show in the end. What would you call this part? Waistband, maybe? Anyway, they are stitched to the front panels and the seams are treated. Finally, we can make a little leather vest by stitching up the shoulder seams. I decided to reuse the old collar and after testing it I found that I had to trim it down a bit before sewing it on. The zipper closure made the shoulder seam extra bulky. I tried my best to flatten it down so it wouldn't mess with my sleeves, but frankly all the extra bulk is welcome here as it makes the silhouette a bit more masculine looking. And then we have the dreaded sleeves. I start by assembling the short one. This has an extra seam in it, probably to make it more fitted. I have no muscle whatsoever and I am not making it smaller. But when cutting it out, I managed to match up the seams so that it would look the same. I also had to make a facing for the back and front. I waited to do so because I couldn't decide whether I wanted to use fake leather or do a lot of piecing. In the end, I decided to use my leather scraps. I also chose to reuse the old lining because it has pockets. And so I strategically placed my pattern. In the lining, you're also supposed to add extra fabric to the back so it can move around more easily. I added the tiniest amount because I didn't want to piece the lining, but it worked out. This far I have 4 pockets, but it will never be enough. Here I'm simply making an extra pocket that I'll sandwich in between the facing and lining. You're not always guaranteed to find straws anymore, and with the amount of spirit gum I'll have on my face while wearing this jacket, I will need one. And make sure you don't sew over the not so historically accurate zipper you stole from the old jacket. After successfully sewing on the facing, it is top stitched down to keep it in place. Then the bottom part of the facing is sewed on. I make a little lining vest to go with the leather vest. They are attached by the neckline. To make the button loops, I folded leather scraps and stitched over them. They are then attached opposite to the buttons, and the front is sewed shut. Here's another tip for you. Look at what you're cutting.
Oh, that was bad.
After trimming away the excess, I added glue to the edges and turned it outside in. It's also not smart to use scissors for this. Even if they're dull, you might rip through a seam. With the neck finished off, it's safe to sew up the side seams, which in this case is only the top 5 cm under each arm. You've been watching my kitten grow up in this video. Here she's been neutered and has to wear a body. I made this one and she absolutely hates it. This will be my lining for my one full sleeve. The sleeve will be buttoned but worn open and I'll need to add facing. And this is the sleeve facing from the old jacket. Then I sew 4 button loops to one side of the closure. I'm doing a lot of weird piecing here again. It would have been easier to sew this to the lining first and save me a lot of trouble. This seam also has visible top stitching on one side, so I'm adding that. I then attached it to the body. Once again, this is not a forgiving material and you need to get this right the first time. Not taking that chance today. Okay. It went better than expected, but I still had a few gaps that I need to take in. This was as close as I was able to sew, and that'll do. With that out of the way, I dared to attach the sleeve lining. Told you so. I mean, oh no, who could have ever seen this coming? My weird piecing had to be sewn by hand and a lot of glue was used. On the original jacket you'll see this top stitching on the sleeve. I would try to do this by machine because I was ready to be done with this. I didn't even bother with how it would look on the inside. The outside is the only thing that matters. And this went about as well as it could have. Because I reused the old colour, I had to continue the existing top stitching down to the front of the jacket too. And I like hand turning my machine, it makes the sewing feel more authentic. As all biker jackets, this one also has a belt. I found a belt with the right buckle, but since I didn't have any more leather, I used plastic instead. The surface looks exactly like the leather I'm using, but it's stretchy. I cut out my little belt and sewed it by machine. It didn't like being stitched and stretched all over the place. I had to top stitch it down and that wore off some of the plastic surface. Mind you, this fabric wasn't cheap. I tried to iron it, but it didn't take. I tried treating this as if it was leather, but this glue that worked so well before didn't work here. I used a leather foot, but this just didn't want to slide under the machine. I also tried placing paper under it, which also didn't work, and this is by far the ugliest part of the jacket. Back with my scraps, I cut out belt loops. These should have been double folded and top stitched, but I didn't have the fabric. I also think I should have made them a little more narrow, at least on the front, but that might have to do more with the size of the jacket I'm making compared to the one I'm copying. I'm not taking any more chances, so these were sewn by hand. While trying the jacket on, my gussets didn't fall back in place and I added a bit of elastic to them so I didn't have to make them non-functional. I'm making as few stitches as possible to not weaken the jacket, and so that my seams won't unravel, I'm adding a bit of fray check. The leather in this jacket is of varying thickness, and I had one of the front panels start wrinkling because it's thinner. A bit of the woven in facing was added to help strengthen it. The hem, if you will, were sewn to the facing by hand. And it's probably frowned upon to use ladder stitches, but this is a stitch used by surgeons, and in this case by me. Here I'm adding that extra thread to the buttons. The sleeves have different buttons to the body. I haven't found a good picture, but they look like round standing buttons or mushroom buttons. I liked the thread and wooden buttons I had, but in keeping with the costuming choices of our flag means death, I chose metal buttons, because at least it looks old. When stitching buttons into leather like this, you're supposed to have a receiving button on the other side so that your needle only passes through the leather at two places. Since they're visible, I didn't do that and instead added more glue. The sleeve lining was finished by hand. This was also done with a ladder stitch. Finally, I'm trimming down the other sleeve. After looking at the photos, I decided it had to be around 5 centimeters on the inner sleeve. This might be spot on, but I also think it ends up looking too long for my arm. And so much time has passed that I've gotten another kitten. More glue was added to keep the seams from unraveling. And if I wanted a nice jacket that for some reason was one sleeve short, this is where the video would end. Unfortunately, we cannot have nice things and now I have to be creative. I tested both alcohol and paint stripper to distress leather. It only ended up distressing me, with the latter dissolving the leather completely. This type of colouring can't be removed easily. Next step would be to drag it after a car or roll around in the mud. But I'm not confident in the quality of my sewing or the leather, so next up is painting. Acrylics look decent until you and your pina colada gets caught in the rain, so here I'm using shoe polish, or to be precise, shoe paint. It's a bit thicker. It doesn't show up well on camera, but it adds a worn and dirty look wherever I applied it. I also used a bit of sandpaper on the high points that would see more wear. He also has crocodile or alligator skin on a pocket and shoulder. This was surprisingly easy to find for sale, but I got some plasticky snake skin instead. I trim around the scales to make it look a bit more real. This pocket is torn open and it looks like the reptile skin is an attempt at mending. It's difficult to tear holes in something you've spent 4 months sewing, so I didn't go overboard but tried to follow the same markings. The mending piece was sewn on using large stitches and a thick thread, copying the stitches on the OG jacket. Then it was glued in place. The other pocket is decorated with 2 large shark teeth and a square button. I haven't found that button yet and I didn't want to add a random one. These are fossilized shark teeth. They are tiny and you can get them everywhere for a small sum. Again, I could buy the big ones, but it cost a lot more and I don't know how they've been sourced, so this will have to do. This wire trick doesn't really work and I added Gorilla Glue to keep it in place. Then the shoulder thingy. This is just a strip of reptile skin with a tooth at the front. Since my teeth is so small and the reptile is a fossilized dinosaur, I used more teeth to cover my sins. The main attraction, however, is the shoulder Pouldron thing. I had some thick leather laying in the attic for whatever reason, and I cut out a rectangle. I sand the edges to soften them since I don't have any leather tools, then I scrub it clean in water and let it dry over a round shape so it will hopefully want to lay on my shoulder. I've spent an embarrassingly long time perfecting a pattern for this motif, and I'm copying it over to the Pouldron using a pokey tool. I scratched some markings into it, and then I painted it to fit the jacket, once again using shoe polish. It did work a lot better to darken it than when I had to go lighter. It took several layers, but in the end it's almost completely black, and once it's fully dry it didn't stain. Now, hear me out. This is going to be stupid. You can definitely buy rivets or studs that have these shapes. I, however, got tired of looking and decided to DIY it. The diamond shape was the hardest to find and I ended up just making them out of aluminium. The round ones and flowers are easier to find, but I decided to save some money by instead buying metal sequins. But then the problem was finding a rivet or a pin that had the right length and head size. I never found it, but I did find these earring studs. Everything was glued in place and left to dry for 24 hours, then the stud was flattened and glued in place. I should have done this earlier, but I'm adding metal eyelets to the sides of the jacket. Since I had so many layers, I poked out a hole before inserting the eyelets. In the scene where he opens his jacket, it looks like there might be 3 shiny dots, but it's really dark, and if there are 3, they are super uneven according to this shot. I chose to only have 2. The sides are laced up with leather thread. The one I bought for this looks too plasticky and isn't all that flexible, so I cut out some from the brown leather and painted them. This didn't work at all, it's too frail to be functional. The Pouldron is attached with 2 rivets and a couple of stitches. We don't see all of them, so some of this is pure guesswork. I lost the footage of me painting the buttons, but I used black acrylic paint and did a bad job because I liked the red shining through. Under one belt loop he has a decorative piece of metal. This same piece appears on his leg brace as well, and I find it so annoying that I couldn't find this. I want to buy it. I feel like I should be able to. Anyway, what you're seeing here is polymorph. It's a moldable plastic. I would not recommend it for this. It looks real ugly, but this is more than 2 hours of work. Clay would have been so much better to use. It was painted and glued on. And that is in fact it. As always, I work a bit backwards when I don't know what I'm doing. I feel like it turned out well enough. Unfortunately, me and my steed went a bit too into character when at last convention and turned into boomers with the camera, so I don't have a lot of footage of the full costume yet. Anyhow, thank you for following along. Until next time. Since you're still here and forgot to turn off the video, here is some awkward footage of me trying to film a TikTok transition. Okay, that's all. Thank you for watching.